There are two main types of inconsistent standard responses. The first type of inconsistent standard responses would be from the same main data, but with some type of interference or variable, which placed into the fruit world would be like measuring different varieties of apples. The second type is when the instrument is measuring completely different responses from unrelated data, or as some people say, as measuring apples and oranges. Both types of inconsistent standard responses will be demonstrated with real data collected from inspections. In this example, the analyst was measuring 2-methyl-naphthalene by EPA method 8270. The analyte's primary quantitation ion, however, is shared by a neighboring analyte, 4-chloro-3-methylphenol. In this slide, showing all 5 calibration levels for 2-methyl-naphthalene, the lower calibration levels of 20, 50, and 80 nanograms shows good separation of the peaks, and the computer is able to drop a perpendicular integration splitting the two peaks. However, as the responses increased and the column became overloaded, the 4-chloro-3-methylphenol peak was sucked totally into the 2-methyl-naphthalene peak. The computer software was unable to discern where to split the peaks, so both were integrated together. The resulting calibration curve plot shows the skewing of the higher standards which contain the additional peak area. The calculated response factor, or RF, relative standard deviation, is 24.2%, which fails the method criteria. When the area response bias in the higher standards was realized, both were manually integrated. The manual integration of the 120 nanogram standard was appropriately performed by dropping a perpendicular integration from the valley between the peaks. The combined 160 nanogram analyte peaks were inappropriately manually integrated by subjectively dropping a perpendicular integration on the front slope of the combined peaks. The appropriate action by the person manually integrating the peak would have been to either drop the 160 nanogram standard from the curve or to rework the method to utilize another ion which would be less affected by colluting peaks. The person performing the inappropriate manual integration, however, left the 160 nanogram standard in the calibration curve because the RF relative standard deviation now met the method criteria at 11.3%. The plot shows that the 160 nanogram standard still does not fit the curve type, even with the inappropriately integrated peak. In this inorganic example, inconsistent standard responses were created for TKN standards through the improper setup of the latchet instrument method. The instrument method contained a specific peak width window, which was too tight to handle the width of the higher standard peaks, thus cutting off part of the tail for applying a peak height response. The larger and wider the peak was, the more bias that was added to the subsequent quantitation. In this case, the peak width window should have been set wider to accommodate all of the standard's peak widths, using the baseline as the basis for the peak height. The second type of inconsistent standard responses measures totally unrelated data and can be likened to measuring apples and oranges. This can be shown from an EPA method 8270 analysis. In this example with the analyte Indeno 123-CD-pyrene, the computer software at the 20, 50, and 120 nanogram standard levels chose the peak at the retention time of 25.01, whereas the computer software for the 80 and 160 nanogram standard level chose the peak at the retention time of 24.39. The calibration plot clearly shows the misalignment of calibration points with the early eluting peaks responses below the line and the late eluting peaks responses above. The 50 nanogram standard response appears to be more in line with the late eluting peak responses. However, This peak was inappropriately manually integrated to add extra baseline noise to increase the response area, as shown in the next slide. It appears that the analyst never figured out that the computer had picked different peaks, because the curve was then used to quantitate samples. So which peak is really indeno 123 CD pyrene? The first peak is indeno 123 CD pyrene, which was correctly chosen by the computer for the 80 and 160 nanogram standards. The second peak is benzo GHI perlene, which was incorrectly chosen by the computer software for the 20, 50, and 120 nanogram standards. If the computer software had correctly chosen the first peak for the 20, 50, and 120 nanogram standards, or the analyst had realized what the computer software had done and switched to the correct peaks, the indeno 123 CD pyrene responses would have lined up well and produced a low response factor relative standard deviation, as shown in this calibration plot. A third example is a combination of the two major types of inconsistent standard responses presented in the previous slides. These inconsistencies were introduced by the lack of a detectable peak response and by the manipulation of the analyst. In the 1 part per billion standard, the analyst has inappropriately manually integrated noise where no detectable peak exists. This created response would be apples and oranges to the other standards presented because the actual response representing the analyte does not exist. The analyst's manual integration of the 2 part per billion and the computer's integration of the 5 and 10 part per billion standards are more consistent, albeit their appropriateness can be debated. The analyst in the 20 part per billion standard manually integrated the whole peak from where the baseline more closely meets the start and end of the peak, unlike any of the previous standards, thus creating inconsistencies for the standard responses. In the 40 part per billion standard, the analyst has inappropriately extended the integration, gathering up additional baseline noise. The green dotted line midway bisecting the 40 part per billion standard represents the same ending scale or window as presented on the 1, 2, 5, 10, and 20 part per billion standards. ADHS does want to stress, however, that just because standard responses are consistent does not mean that they are scientifically valid and defensible. In this example, the laboratory's ion chromatography analysis of fluoride by EPA method 300 had the computer integrating part of the back edge of the water dip for all standards. All of the standards were consistently integrated this way. However, this is inappropriate and adds an inconsistent bias to the peaks as the standard concentrations vary.